very special second night of the new Shul's third annual Kumah Festival. Kumah means rise up. This celebration is one finds itself at the intersection of faith, art, and politics. And rise up is a very fitting exhortation for the new Shul, since we are a community of doers and seekers who aspire to engage with each other and the world, making meaning and shedding light. And this evening we have the honor and privilege of welcoming Letty Cotton-Bin, lecturer, social justice activist, founding editor of this magazine, and author of 12 books. In conversation about her most recent book, Shanda, a memoir of shame and secrecy, with the wonderful Erica Sasson, attorney and restorative justice practitioner and a very important member of the new Shul. And I leave you all now to Erica. Enjoy the evening.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here with Letty and with all of you. This is really great. Before we get started, I'm glad people have wine, people have food. Just be relaxed. You know, this is a time for all to hear voices. So just before we start, maybe just turn to someone next to you, because you're gonna have to exercise your voice too. So turn to someone next to you and just say why you were motivated to do the schlep. There was some schlepping that happened to get here. So just take a second to tell the story of your schlep.
Jennifer, I helped her a few years ago, and she gave me permission. We're going to talk about permission for
this is a long process of preparation, which is not the subject matter of tonight's event. But just to say, when she finished it, when she spoke the words she needed to speak, she slept for 3 days. Her children said that they felt that she had been returned to them. She said that she felt like everyone needs this opportunity for healing. Opportunity is the key word. Not everybody feels in the same way. An opportunity for healing, an opportunity for liberation. So when Letty said she'd written a book, and so before I, even go there, the thing that I'm trying to help people move through is this shame. It's the secret. It's the not speaking. It's I'm thinking of our pre-Zoom. There's a few group of people here in our pre-Zoom. I couldn't speak the words. That feeling like I cannot speak the words. All of that. What is that tied to? What's that about? And so when I saw that Letty had written a book, a memoir of shame and secrecy, I was like, I think maybe a lot of people got excited. I got really, really excited to have an opportunity to dig through these ideas with you. As Maya said, Letty's been a truth teller, a fighter, an activist. We were just talking about how she helped found JFRED. She's been in the fight and been saying many true things for a very long time. And the fact that now there's a book that we can talk about that's about your family and your story and those difficult things, not the difficult things that are out there, just really resonates for me. I'm going to say one last thing about Kumah and why we're here, kind of picking up on what Maya said to welcome us, just to put us in the framework of this festival. I've said a lot of already maybe triggering and upsetting things, so I hope everyone is okay. My stories, they tend to be a little bit on the more difficult side. But this is a festival of rising up, and my vision that the way that I can speak words to rising up is speaking up. And so I think that the reason this fits into the festival is let's start doing some speaking up. We have a really complex landscape out there. We have, as we all know, rights that have just disappeared. We're going to talk about those, the rights that have disappeared in front of our eyes. We have the common trauma of the pandemic that we've experienced in different ways. We have all of these things that we're sitting on and sitting with, and then we have our own stories as well. And we're going to just a little bit tonight try to do some of with Letty, through her guidance, through her stories, try to do some speaking up so that we can make a little bit more sense of our world, of ourselves, and maybe rise up a little bit. Yes?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so with that, I am so honored to begin this evening with Letty Cotton-Cokerman. I like to say her name is both Letty Cotton-Cokerman. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with some questions from me to Letty for the next half hour or so, and then we'll open it up for you to share what's coming up for you. What do you want to talk about? Okay, so we'll get to that piece, but we'll start here. Should I start straight up with a question or what?
Absolutely.
All right. Okay. So I wanted to just start with this opener about, that there's, if you've read the book, and lots of people haven't, there's no test at the end, don't worry. But there's a lot of beautiful stories about her family. It's really a story also about love, about supportive characters. There's so many characters in this book, and I think you could have reframed it under a lot. And certainly shame and secrecy was something you were wrestling with, but telling those true stories, there could have been another theme attached to it. And I want to know why you chose to foreground shame and secrecy so matter-of-factly.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you for inviting me, and thank all of you for coming. And it's fun to look out there and see three people from my beloved Clippers whom we met for several years under the tutelage of Dan Smoker doing the car shop week, and we bonded in boxes. And I see a member of my former Roach Cutters group, Karen, out there, so I feel at home immediately. I also lived across the street when I was single. I lived from 1961 to 1963 at 21 Westlaw. And I was just telling Erica that I had my first kiss with my husband in the doorway of what was the Macmillan building on the corner. So I'm a village going to do what writers do, which is, more or less I was born in, and then I went to school at, and then I met so-and-so, and then this happened to me, and that happened to me. These were my downs, these were my ups. And suddenly I realized, as I have about 80 pages, that every chapter is about a secret. And it was not a conscious act. It was a way of surfacing my family stories, which I knew had left a very deep impact on me. All my family members were very larger than life, very vivid. You've read the book, you probably can't believe any one family would hold out their we should have the secret. We should have the secrets. We can go into them. They contain the image story. And I could have done that. I could have said that I'm writing a chronicle of the last of a breed, which is the people who came in poverty and made it, and the children who, 2 generations later, in my case, are Yaleys, not myself, my kids, and then my grandkids. How did that happen when my mother came off the boat in cardboard shoes, and she was ashamed of everything in her life? Having come in poverty, having an accent, being in the wrong clothes, cooking with the wrong smells, not fitting in, wanting desperately to be a real American. That was an immigration wave, as distinct from today's, that believed in the melting pot and not the many-splendored quilt. These were women and men who sloughed off the old world and everything that it entailed, the old language. I was not allowed to learn Yiddish. Yiddish was the language of my parents' secrets. That's how they talked in front of the kinder, right? Yiddish. So if we learned it, they would use the code. The absolute driving force of my parents' and aunts and uncles' life was to become real Americans. And that meant presenting a very polished face to the world. That meant decoding what it meant to be an American, how Americans behaved, what were their aspirations, what were their models. My mother's Bible was a lady's home journal and good housekeeping. She thought she had really mastered American culture when she gave up making gefilte fish with the fish swimming in the bathtub and learned to make mighty fine pudding out of the package. The package was the miracle. Learning to use packaged things and canned things, none of which there was in her shtetl. She came from a little shtetl called Pillikitz in Hungary. And so things that we now consider, coarse and lowly, like mixed pudding that comes in a tiny box, for her it was, I put this out and I put it in the right dish and I have it in a sherbet glass and I put a little bit of whipped cream on and I get a maraschino cherry and it looks just like good housekeeping. That was her pride, losing her accent. But I'll just give you a sense of the intensity of this objective, what a driving force it was. The fear of the Shanda, the fear of not measuring up, the fear of being judged inadequate. My mother dropped out of school in the 8th grade. How many have read the book? Okay, enough happened, so I will have to give you this flavor. She dropped out of school in the 8th grade to help support her family. My mother was one of 7. My father was one of 7. I'm one of 24 cousins. A very large family, not to mention the strangers who married in. The family was so tight, in-laws were suspect for a while. But it was a huge family, and everyone was on the same track. Everyone in his or her way, whether it was a homemaker, which meant, you didn't have to work for a woman not to have to work, was a credit to her husband, right? If your wife had to work, you were not a good provider. That was the masculine paradigm. And I discovered that my father was a pretender, my mother was a pretender, in terms of their inability to match the paradigm, but their ability to create and invent some version version of it. Oh, that's so much better. I had a really tiny little voice, and now. So when she dropped out of school and went to work in a sewing machine factory, the classic and the great story, you've seen it in the movies, my mother started saving up money and went to a photo studio, places where they have backdrops and props and so on. And she paid a little bit every week to have a photograph made that faked a high school graduation picture. She went to the prop box and took out a diploma. She put on a little attachable chignon that made her look older because at the time she was like 14 when she cropped out, or 13. And she got the diploma, the long stem roses, to look as if this was her graduation from high school. If she had been asked point blank, Seal, you be married from high school, she would not have lied. But she kept a picture of herself, very prominently displayed wherever she lived from the time she was a little kid until throughout my childhood, so that people would just assume she was a high school graduate. So my mother was busy constructing fictional persona from a very young age. And one other quick anecdote, and then we can understand why I was impelled to write this with that title. Shame became so dominant as I wrote page after page. I remember the story of how my mother, who lived in, if you've ever been to 97 Orchard Street, the tenement museum, that's where they lived, in a 3-room place with 7 children. And my mother, her biggest Shanda was that she was married before. I did not know this. I didn't learn this till I was 12. Discovering your parents as lawyers is a very hard thing. That was sort of the secret that molded me. In any case, she was then single for 10 years after the first marriage, ended in divorce, a super Shanda in 1927 when she was divorced. My mother would get on the subway after she finished her first full day of work and go all the way to the North Bronx and scurry into her rich uncle's apartment, which you can just imagine was maybe on Grand Concourse and therefore not the Lower East Side tenement that she lived in, and have my uncle pretend to be her father because he could speak English. Her father, my grandfather, couldn't. And she would pretend and let her dates pick her up there. And then at the end of the evening when her date was over and she would be delivered back to Uncle Will's, she would get back in the subway and go all the way home by herself to the tenement, rather than have anyone pick her up and see the poverty in which they lived. So those two formative stories about my mother's, she was an activist. Think about it. She saw the need to create a different face, to present a different face to the world. She felt like a different person than the one that appeared, the one who couldn't afford the best, the one who couldn't speak perfectly. So she rid herself of her accent. She falsified her high school graduation pictures. They were quite lame. And she traveled to the Bronx and back on a date night, all to avoid the shame. So that's how it ended up being shot. But I can't speak about anything without 3 or 4 anecdotes attached to the answer. Sorry.
That's great. Do you want to tell us a little bit? I mean, I have a lot of questions, but the one that is coming up for me first is, what does it feel like to say their names, to have people have read the book and know your parents' names?
I have never been asked that, and it triggers. Well, I hate that word.
I would use the right word. So.
Yeah. It elicits in me feelings of deep intimacy with the reader. And the reader says, I couldn't get over when Betty did this after my sister, who was like my second mother. I feel I can talk to this reader about their lives. I want to know more about them because they already know my sister. They know her so well. They know what she meant to me. They know her sacrifice. They know she saved all my letters from Brandeis. She gave me the big shopping bag with hundreds of letters in it that made of this memoir something so much richer than it would have been. And I feel very sorry for memoirists and biographers and historians in the future who will not be able to find, as I did. In the middle of writing this memoir, I think I was 81 by the time I found this, and I was already 3 years or more into the book, to find a humongous plastic shopping bag that filled in the blanks, that revealed to me my parents' trajectory, revealed to me their secrets, their arguments, the chemistry I sensed, because they were always very explosive and they argued, and he was a law school graduate and a Talmud scholar, and she was an 8th grade graduate. She was a greenhorn. He was born here and grew up in New Haven. You know, he had the kind of Jewish knowledge that she revered, greatly. She had to go to, whatever you call it, adult learning courses. Adult education, thank you, at either Queens College or at the Jamaica Jewish Center, where we live in Queens. So I think the names, after a while, if you're reading the book, the names do conjure people. In fact, there's a suggested question section in the back of the book. That's what authors have to do now, is the book clubs sections. Set questions as if they couldn't think up their own.
We're not going to use any of those questions.
But one of the questions that I thought of is, who would play me? Who would play Betty? Who would play you? I wondered, and when I do, I've done over 70 of these book talks since the book was published in September. And I've only been asked once who I think would play me, so I'll tell you just unbidden. You have to ask Barbara Streisand. Who would play my husband? Jean-Paul Trentin. And the name correctly. You do? Oh, a wonderful, intense, sexy French actor of the era. Of course, my husband is. And who would play my mother? Meryl Streep, in makeup. And who would play my grandfather? Alec Guinness.
So you brought up your sister, so we're going to talk a little bit first about the book. You want me to take the mic? All right.
Yeah.
So you brought up your sister, and that's really where that question for me came from, about she's such a beautiful character in the book. It's the one that I feel like she's the one you give to your readers. Here's like the relatable person. Here's the person that you can kind of walk with as you're having, you character in the book are having so many feelings. And then there's this kind of North Star of your sister. That's how I read it, at least. And so for me, it was a question of like bringing this. Well, I have two questions. I'll start with this one, and it's just a follow-up on that last one. But I won't be done with Betty yet, which is, bringing her so lovingly into the present. I just felt like it was, I don't know if it's a gift to your grandchildren, if it's a gift to your kids, but like the way that you make Seal and Jack and Betty so alive. I just imagine like how much one misses these people. And then also just, how do we bring our ancestors into, we don't do that very often. We don't bring our ancestors into the room.
Oh God, so many things to tell you. One is that there's a study that seems pretty dispositive about what a central element that creates confident children are children who know what they came from, who they came from. Children who are deeply rooted in their genealogy with character, not just, that was Uncle Sarah and Jane. But something about them that roots them, that allows children to feel, I would live like that, or I would never have done that. And secondly, what comes to mind is what I was saying before about how I pity today's historians and memoirs, because they're not going to have the hard evidence, of letters, scribbled notes even. Photographs with names on the back and dates on the back, and this was at Shrub Oak in my case, Shrub Oak, 1942. Suddenly, I'm there, and there are, 12 of my 24 cousins, and, there's somebody with a World War II uniform, and suddenly, I know that feeling. I'm right back there as a 5-year-old, and the war is over, as a 6-year-old, and the war is over. Now, what we're leaving our children is, emails with LMK, IRU. And this is not material. This is not substance, so that's kind of sad. Bringing these people to life, I developed tremendous compassion for them and for their life, the amount of assembly that they did. You would think that I would be building a case for terrible people. I come from all these liars. Well, we all come from a lot of liars. Think about the Torah. It's full of liars. It's full of liars. It's full of trickery. It's full of masks. And it's full of veils. We have only thing to think about, Jacob ends up with Leah. He thought he was marrying Rachel. Trick. Rebecca connives with Jacob. Fakes the skins. Liars, right? Dissemblers, tricksters. My family was in that honored tradition. Honored tradition of doing what you have to do. And, our forefathers and mothers did it at the behest of God in most cases, or God did it. God made a lot of this crap happen for a reason, right? It was always for a larger reason, a larger purpose. And the same is true for our families, who dissembled, who pretended, whose reach exceeded their grasp, or is it the other way around? I always forget, but you know what I mean? And I ended up having compassion for my father, who I was tremendously resentful of all my life, basically, really. Because the only way I could get my father's attention was if we sat at the dinner table and I asked him about a tractate of Talmud or about one of his cases. Otherwise, he was out of here. He was out of here. He was a mocker. He had to go to his meetings. He was the president of everything you could be the president of in Queens, New York. He was, including county commander of the Jewish War Veterans, that president of the Queens ZOA, a very different ZOA from today's Mort's ZOA. He was president of the Shul. I was the little girl of the big macher, so I could sit up on the bima on his lap or, scamper around undeterred. That was my father to me. He was not a presence in my life. He was an absence, but he was ostensibly a father who lived in my house, but hardly ever there. And he was also a bit of a peacock, a little bit of a show-off. He used his vocabulary kind of to put down my mother, calling her a greenhorn, asking her, who were the first 5 kings of England, things that he knew she couldn't possibly answer. Just so, and then he would say, he's just joking, just kidding. And he also, he pretended to be much more successful than he was, because he had this impetus of the Jewish 1950s view of masculinity, which is, that you have to be a good provider, and you have to have nice clothes and a nice car and a nice house. So he was always clawing to get a step ahead in that regard. I had no idea that the whole thing was a charade until I found the letters. And then I discovered my father was living literally like client to client, or bill to the bill, or hand to mouth, or whatever. My father was putting up a front as much as my mother was putting up a front, always, of being a little beyond who she really was. I ended up, rather than decrying those behaviors, respecting what it was that allowed them to find a way to justify it. I mean, remain pretty moral, pretty ethical people, except in these personal matters, except in performative matters of the self.
So there's a lot of nodding, and I'm gonna assume that some of you are thinking about people in your own life. Can I get like a physical, yes, thinking about people in your own life? And I'm wondering, this is actually just a question I have, maybe even, what do you think, why is it that you tell these stories about one man named Jack? And why does everyone immediately think about the people in their life who lied, dissembled, were ashamed, struggled? What is it about such personal, individualized storytelling that causes people to reflect?
Well, I first have to establish that I know I'm writing about the Ashkenazi experience. I'm not writing about the Spartan experience, and so
We have lots of that.
we have lots of.
We have lots of dissembling and shame and
Yeah.
all of it. We're there. We're right there.
Okay, but I can't vouch for that with my kishkas the way I for the other. So I think the nodding comes of, a cultural recognition. When I describe everybody sitting around a table and 3 more people come in, and somehow or other bridge chairs appear and stools get pulled in and everybody edges a little and there's a kid sticking up here and another one on my lap. And everybody says, been there, done that. I have sat at those tables. We know what that feels like. We know the kind of, come in, there'll be enough. Bring in an extra, bring an extra chair because we run out. And that just, and the fact that when you come into a Jewish, it isn't called a dinner party. When you come for supper, okay, or supper, usually, you do not expect to be greeted with a drink. It's the food. It's all about the food. And in my family, the bottle of schnapps was on the top of the linen closet. There was no such thing as a selection. There was the schnapps at the top of the linen closet, and otherwise, you have to bring your own. But it did, because nobody drank. I grew up, you may have also grown up with the axiomatic confidence that Jews were not alcoholics, right? I was taught Jews are not alcoholics, and my family was testimony to that. Because people could have an entire evening and not ask, can I have a drink? Really. They were just not interested. Manischewitz, always. Manischewitz was on the table, always. Club soda, in the spritz bottle, always. But not a hard liquor. It just wasn't a thing. And fine wine, forget it. Not even kosher wine. It was Manischewitz or nothing, really. So there are certain things that I think when you're nodding, you can get the tongue, the taste, the texture of what it was like to grow up in that kind of family. And maybe you can, I'll give you an example of a secret that I thought was going to be really unique to my family. And it's in the book. My Aunt Joan, my Uncle Herbie comes home from, he was really the handsome one who rose above 5'8" in the family. And he came home with an announcement that he was marrying this woman. She was from Jacksonville, Florida. Right away that was like Exotica. Miami, yes. Jacksonville, who went to Jacksonville. She was a very sophisticated woman, and she dressed differently than my aunts, and she was very thin, and she was very, her hair was always bobbed, style I'd never even seen before. And I was told that Joan was barren. And when I was growing up, nobody was supposed to bring their children anywhere near her. Be very careful, don't talk about children in front of Joan. She's barren, it's so sad. This is post-Holocaust Jewish family. A woman who couldn't have children? What a Shanda. What a tragedy, what a sorrow. Okay, so I have 3 children, and in 1968, I had just given birth to my son. We're at the Seder at my sister's house in Larchmont, and I put my son in the corner in one of those boxes. There was no such thing as an infant seat. It was a box with a little flat mattress in it. My son is lying in the box in the corner sleeping, and I'm sitting on the couch with a chocolate-covered matzah. My Aunt Jonas was sitting on the couch with a chocolate-covered matzah, and we're chatting. I was always fascinated by her because she just didn't look like anybody else. She was Jewish, but you wouldn't have known it from the look. It was my feeling. I had a stereotyped view that based on my own aunt. And I am trying to talk about everything but what she wants to talk about. She wants to talk about little David. Little David is small, but oh my. Little David is in the box. And he's about 3 weeks old because he was born in April, Passover time. And she wants to ask me, how was your labor? And how are the twins? I have twin daughters. How are the twins reacting to him? And he's so cute, and they're so cute, but now they're not the only ones. She's going on, and I'm trying to talk about the chocolate-covered matzah. I'm talking about how Barton's is now making dark chocolate. Isn't it amazing how it tastes so much better than it used to taste? And she's still just talking about my children. And finally she grabs me and she says, let it stop censoring yourself. I've had 2 abortions. What? I mean, we've been paying you all these years for nothing. She said, in your family, you could never say, I don't want children. You could only say, I can't have children. Because in your family, you had to replenish our people, and everybody was very fertile in my family. Everybody had, at least 2, but 3 and 4 children. My sister had 4 children. There were several who had 3 children, and here she's barren, and we felt sorry for her, and she just couldn't admit that she didn't want, she and her didn't want. And so she said after, being hopped in China, that expression, hopped in China, sort of being harassed by the women in the family. When are you going to get pregnant, Joni? Why aren't you pregnant yet, Joni? She said, I finally admitted I'm barren. So here's another secret, another lie. Is, people who have lied about being infertile, but never got infertile.
I love that story in the book. That's just one of the best ones. You said abortion, I didn't. I have written about my abortion. You have in this book written, am I allowed to share spoilers? Spoiler alert. 2 abortions. And I'm going to just not make eye contact and imagine that people are also nodding about things that they have gone through in the reproductive health space. And so this is a really big and important topic, and it is something that's on all of our minds. And so I'm gonna, I have questions more about the book, and we'll go back to the book, but I do want to pivot a little bit on this question. I see Linda here, focused on this topic as well.
Before you can ask that, but it's going to be a policy question or
maybe
a legal
we'll
one.
have to find out.
I just need to say that I wrote about having had an abortion in the New York Times in 1995 because I thought it was very important to have a voice on the page of the New York Times of someone who had actually had one. Abortion had been legal since 1973, and in 1995 people were still not talking about having had abortions. And that's why we lost, guys, because we never made it anything less than a stigma because we wouldn't talk about it even to each other. So it was legal, but still we let the right wing glom a stigma onto it. And therefore we didn't organize, and therefore we didn't give testimony and speak bitterness and tell our stories. We still didn't even say to each other, did you ever have an abortion? Did you ever know anybody had an abortion? And how was it? What went on? What were the circumstances? Humanizing with real stories. We didn't do that. Okay, I have my own little secret, which is that when I wrote about having had an abortion in the New York Times, I did not write about having had 2 abortions in the course of 4 months in my senior year at Brandeis. I can't even begin to tell you what Shanda it was, except to say that I was planning either to jump off the Bronx Whitestone, Triborough, or in front of the F train. I had my plan, really. This is not a joke. I could not face my family, the family I grew up in, and say that I was pregnant, quote, out of wedlock. Why did I not come clean on the second one? And this makes the story Jewish. This makes the story Jewish. All of these stories have such an intrinsic Jewish element to them. Because I was raised to believe that you didn't have to be beautiful, which I was never going to be, but you had to be smart. Getting pregnant at 7 times in 4 months was stupid. I could not admit on the pages of the New York Times that I'd been stupid. I really couldn't. I couldn't even out myself that extra step, because that would speak to the Jewish part of me. That would say, how could you not figure out birth control? I mean, my mother died when I was 15. I never had the conversation. I pieced together from the bits and pieces in high school, Jamaica High School hygiene of, how people get pregnant. But I just didn't know, and I never figured it out, and I was the same guy, and I just, suffice it to say, I got pregnant twice in 4 months, had 2 abortions with different doctors, different stories, none of which, I could out myself about that second abortion. So that the layers of shame attached to abortion and the lack of our ability to tell our stories, each different than the next, and to have that sisterhood, that commonality, that reaching out and saying, if ever you need me. So when I was already the mother of 3 almost grown children, my kids were teenagers, I was sitting in my sister's kitchen, and a newspaper came, and the local Westchester newspaper showed a headline saying that a woman had been found in a motel with a botched abortion. She had died from a botched abortion. And it just came out of me. Now, mind you, I never told my sister, who was 14 years older than myself and had 4 children. And I thought of as a perfect person, an upright, married lady who would think I was a trollop if she'd ever known. Could never confide in my darling sister, who became my second mother after my mother died. And here the story just burbles out of my mouth. And my sister said, how could you not come to me? I said, because you would be horrified and you would think awful things about me. She said, are you kidding? I had an abortion. Mom had an abortion. Grandma had an abortion. I said, what? It's like the thing with John. It's like, why didn't anybody tell me? Why don't we share these things? I wouldn't have been so terrified and so lost and so ready to kill myself, literally ready to kill myself, if I knew that my family had to use abortion as birth control the way millions and millions of women had to before there was easy birth. I just think it needed more than just going by.
All right.
Now go ahead and ask.
No, go somewhere else. What's going on?
Too controlling women.
Too
So
controlling.
what you just shared, that story about Betty, I think is the most beautiful story in the book, in my opinion. And I wanted to just read for those of you who haven't read this piece of it. She writes her a letter. Can I read this? Betty writes a letter to Letty after, I didn't realize her name's
They didn't because I wasn't like,
Orrin
I
Letty.
wasn't.
Got it. She writes her a letter after they have this talk where she tells her what's happened with her abortion, and she says, she does a long, beautiful letter, but then she also says, I don't know if I succeeded in getting across to, I can't even read it. I would never be able to do what you've done. I can't read this without crying. I don't know if I succeeded in getting across to you my one main and deepest feeling, that no matter what you have done or will do or why, I will never think less of you or love you less than before you told me.
That was Betty. Betty wrote me a letter. Betty wrote me a letter that, I guess that night after I left, we went back to the city, because I got it 2 days later, and which she made clear that, and because I lived across the street here with my motor scooter and my dog and so on, and a lot of dates, let's put it that way, because I was single in New York for quite a while before I married my husband, and then, led a completely different life. And I thought if my sister knew anything about my life, she would really deplore it, and I would bring dishonor to our family. And partly it was a life I wanted to lead, but partly it was a life of acting out against God for taking my mother, which I've spent my whole life sort of doing that. The feeling that something is owed to me for that. I'm allowed to do this, I'm allowed to do that, I'm allowed to be a troublemaker. Because, how could that have happened to me at such a young age? And left me with this father who was not ever there.
I'm so grateful you're sharing these things. These are incredible stories.
Not now when. Seriously, we're so busy protecting on stories that they're not worth hiding. They're not worth hiding, these stories. My goal is to lead a secret-free life, and you talked before about feeling light. Who's talked about the lightness of the burden is gone. I mean, I'm 83 now, and since I finished this book, I have felt like I'm floating compared to who I was, carrying all the crap that I was carrying around. Not just my own, but realizing what my family had to go through and hide and dissemble and pretend and feel inadequate and feel unworthy and all that. And now it's out there, and I wish that everybody would do this, make an oral history for your kids. If you're not a writer, get a journal and maybe find out you are a writer. Talk to them, put out there what you've been hiding and say, like if I knew my grandma's story, I think I would have been a feminist from birth. My grandma, who, imagine the most old-worldly grandma you can, a woman with, she had very straight, gray-black hair. Nobody in my family got completely gray until they died. And she had a unibosom, with straight down. And she had an apron welded to her body. I never saw her without an apron. And she had swollen ankles from standing and cooking. That was my grandma. And she spoke Yiddish and very rudimentary English, no matter how long she was here. So even though she lived in our finished basement, she and my grandfather lived in our finished basement in Queens for several years, and I'm right upstairs. I never knew my grandmother because we couldn't really talk. She was quiet, and I was a little wary of bringing my friends downstairs because very often her teeth were in a glass of water, and it was all a little grungy, and they would eat Wonder Bread and warm milk. And I didn't want my friends to see these, foreign ways. So I never really hung out with my grandma. And then I discovered when my Aunt Tilly, everyone needs an Aunt Tilly, blurts out, oh, that was with Grandma's first husband. What? Again, you just can't even absorb what's being told to you. My grandmother was married my grandfather in 1898. She had a first husband. Wait a minute and back up. And it turns out my grandmother was a runaway bride. That she was betrothed to somebody like Laser Wolf. Much older, not attractive. She was young, she was a teenager. And the ceremony goes through, and when he goes to change into whatever Orthodox men change into when they take off everything, she ties together all the bed sheets in this little inn in Piliputz in Hungary in 1898, ties together the bed sheets, shimmies out the window, and runs away to my grandfather, Nathan, and they get married in Poland. So I knew that I had a grandmother who, like, under her crocheted shawl, her Afghan shawl was Wonder Woman's cape. I would have had a completely different view of her and her legacy. The legacy of transgression and a transgressive behavior and daring and bravery and a sense of agency that allowed her to go and marry the man she wanted to marry. It was unimaginable to me that this woman was that woman. Mm-hmm. So we cheat our children and grandchildren of the complexity of who we really are when we present a sort of cleaned up version of ourselves. I did have trouble only once when trying to tell the truth to my grandchildren. I have 2 granddaughters and 4 grandsons who are now in their 20s, 5 years apart among the 6 of them. And I did get stuck when one of my granddaughters asked me, "How old were you, Grandma, when you first had sex?" I suddenly did not know what my daughter would have wanted me to say. So I said, I'll tell you after I talk to Mommy.
I'm wondering, so that's a real drop the mic moment. I'm wondering about, you're 83, I'm 44. I don't feel the ownership. I was just thinking about a story of my grandmother right now. She's passed away. And our other grandmother is ailing right now. My sister and I are really going through it. But my grandmother, who passed away a long time ago, has a story of being in Egypt. So we're from the Sephardic side of things, where we have, I don't know the word kishkiz. I learned it at a new shul ceremony, and I turned to my mother-in-law and said, "Misha said kishkiz. What's that?" She goes, "You really are not Ashkenazi." I don't know what it's saying. So my grandmother in Egypt was supposed to marry a man, was just told she was going to marry a man. Don't correct me if I get this wrong. I'm worried. I'm worried to get it wrong. So she is meant to marry a man, and she doesn't want to marry him. And my other grandmother had a similar experience and cried her way out of it. But this grandmother, Becky, she basically goes over to his house somewhere in Cairo, his work somewhere in Cairo, and says, "If you make me marry you, I will make your life a living hell." That's where I come from. It's so wonderful to know the story. It's so wonderful to know the story. But she's passed away, and I feel okay telling her story. But I wonder, and I do have to ask you, as I have a responsibility to ask you policy questions, because we need your help right now in this moment. So I will go back to our policy question. But I want to ask you before that, what do you say to my generation about the people you wrote about have passed away? And I don't know if there's a sense of, I know there's a sense of loss. I felt that throughout the whole book. But I do wonder about a sense of freedom as well to tell your story in your own words, in your own way. And I don't know, I think some of us at different parts of these generations, I have small kids. So another example, I wrote about an abortion I had when I was pregnant with twins. And that's my youngest son. I don't know when to have the conversation with him about the fact that that's his story too, even though we share it so personally.
What did you think about
I couldn't breathe when I read that chapter. She writes about maybe evidence in a letter that she might have been a twin in her mother's belly. And when I read that, I thought, oh, that's why we're doing this event. Because that was just huge for me to think, what has it done to my son to have had the experience?
How old is he now?
He's literally 6.
You don't have to tell when he's 6, but
again, how do we tell other people's stories? story?
Yeah.
Where's the ownership? What's mine?
That story is his story, whether he knows it or not. And I'm gonna get the chills from this, because when I found out through 3 mentions in letters between my father and my PS of my sister, my father went to Palestine to settle the affairs of his father, who was killed in an Arab raid in Tiberias. Fine, except he left behind my mother, who was 7 months pregnant with me. He didn't have to go then, he could have gone sooner, he could have waited, but he went then, which again tells you something about my father. In any case, I found out because of the letters that my parents wrote while he was in Palestine, and they wrote to each other every day or twice a day, that there was this PS, Mom is doing fine and the twins are kicking. And again, Mom is doing great and the twins are kicking. That's Betty's PS on my mother's letters to my father. And then my father writes a letter on the ship coming home, how he lost a contest, a dance contest. He's writing to my mother about it now. He's in a dance contest on board the ship. And he lost it. Pinochle, he didn't. But it's okay because he's coming home and he knows Mom loves me, you love me to Betty, and the twins love me. So that's 3 mention in the letters of the twins when my mother's pregnant 7 months with me. I think I was a twin. Yeah. My sister Betty, who was 14 years old when my mother came out of the hospital, and my father met, drove Betty and himself to pick up my mother and me in her babe in arms. Betty says it was one baby, and I said, well, what happens if the other baby? You mean you don't know? You weren't in the delivery room. She said I would have known, and somehow it would have come out. But when you read the book, or if you've read the book, you know that in my family, it was easy to imagine that my mother didn't tell anyone she was pregnant with twins because she was severely superstitious. I say severely because it hobbled her very often. And one of her superstitions was you never talked about your pregnancy because it would bring down the evil eye, the eye in her eye, the evil eye. So, my mother went my whole childhood spitting on my forehead. Anytime anybody ever complimented me for anything, at night I got on my forehead. Suck out the evil. I don't know if you've ever had that. In any case, my mother would never have told anybody she was pregnant with twins, because that was not what you did. You did not anticipate God's will by preening or imagining everything's going to be fine. You quietly prayed nonstop that this would be a healthy birth. That's all you did. My father believed in the halakha, which is that you do not mourn for a child that is not 30 days or 30 days, has not lived at least 30 days. You can't have you don't have a funeral, a shiva, a shloshim, you do nothing like that. It's, quote, according to the rabbis, as if the child had never existed. So my father would be following halakha. It's as if the child never existed. If it died, this fetus died. And my mother would have never told anyone anyway. So I never know, but I have always felt that I have someone with me. Even when I'm completely alone, I'm in a scary situation, I never feel alone. So if your son grows up with that feeling, he needs to understand why. Just so he doesn't feel like a weirdo. That's my advice.
Yeah, I know if it was a boy or a girl. Me? Or a lady?
No, me?
Yeah.
Nobody ever admitted it or told me. There was nobody around to verify it. And my sister had no memory of anything but me coming out in the nurse's arms of my father, letting her carry me all the way home.
What kind of scans did they have in those days to even know that it was twins?
I think we're moving to the question now.
Sorry.
By will of the people.
Sorry, I take it back.
Well, I was pregnant with twins, and the method used on my belly was a stethoscope.
Yeah, true.
It didn't have scanners.
I want to give you I do want to give you a chance to answer my policy question, which is that we need you and we need your generation, and we need to know what we're doing wrong. Or maybe we're not doing anything wrong and it's not our fault, so maybe that's a whole part of the shame of all of this. But you've lived through it, you lived pre-Roe, we're in a post-docs, and we need your voice. I don't even know what to ask you other than help us.
Well, I've said part of it, which is I don't blame us, of course, for the right wing, for the backlash, for the horrific, evangelical movement's obsession with the fetus fetishism and all of that. But I do feel that we missed the boat on one strategy that would have created a movement that normalized abortion as healthcare, normalized abortion as the most responsible pro-child thing you could possibly be for, because what happens to unwanted children is a Shanda. The collective Shanda of us forcing women to have children that we know what women are capable of in terms of, a non-maternal woman is a dangerous force in a child's life. You're alone with a baby, and you're an angry person. And what happens between you and that baby, God forbid, is unimaginable. Can be, and that's why children bear so many scars from mothers who didn't want them, parents who weren't there together, or just the inadequacy of an income to support children, and then you have the economic stress, and then you have marital stress, and then it's acted out on the children, and the neglect that goes around. I mean, abortion is pro-choice is pro-child, is how I would put it, because you take seriously the responsibility of child. We missed that. We missed establishing that as our campaign. We were always in a defensive mode and in a shame mode and in a stigma. We bought into it, and we whispered about it, and we snuck our way into the clinics, and we didn't tell anybody while we were out of school, for a few days. We didn't. Even with the so-called legal right, which, by the way, was eroded almost immediately by things like parental consent and waiting periods and, sonograms and forced films and all the things that we actually put women through to exercise a right. Then we couldn't even imagine a right being withdrawn. Mm-hmm. We never experienced a right being withdrawn. I mean, we had prohibition and then we got rid of it. But, that was a massive failure. Everyone saw that it was a failure as a policy. And it was simply funding the smugglers and the people who, knock, knock, it's Joe, whatever those things were called, underground bars. So, I mean, there was no experience in not only our own lifetimes, but ever, of somebody taking away a constitutional right. So women, even activist women, couldn't imagine. They could imagine more erosions of the right, but not the eradication of the right. And without that, you don't act. Without extremis, without, a real threat, it's very hard to mobilize people who are non-political, who think that when it's my turn, it'll be there. I might have to wait, I might have to sit through a film, I might have to go and listen to this lecture, or get a parental or a judge to sign a thing, but it'll be there. It didn't occur to anybody that it could disappear. So that's just a very superficial analysis. What I think also is that we didn't at first do a little more state-by-state stuff the way Ruth Ginsburg suggested. New York was ahead of the game. If we had a sort of a meaningful core of states that had legalized it and that had shown that women didn't have a manicure and then an abortion, that fear that we're just going to go off and have abortions galore, and have abortion parties, and I don't know what they imagined that we would be so sanguine about having an abortion. Nobody does that lightly. It's just that so many people cannot imagine what the experience is. And we who have been through it didn't tell them. And I often thought about how when I gave birth, I really hadn't been told how painful it was. Because women tend to forget, and then you don't want to scare your friends who haven't had children. You don't want to tell them, the real blood and gore and pain of it, unimaginable pain of it. So that we, generation after generation, by protecting women, we don't prepare them really for the pain of childbirth, unless you've been through like Elizabeth Bing's, natural childbirth classes. Then you get a lot of that preparation, which I did, and it didn't work anyway. But with abortion, if only we had done the opposite and said, it's really not, it's not a terrible thing. The right wing has made this into such a terrible thing. Childbirth is what? 100 times more unsafe, more dangerous. Childbirth is 100 times more dangerous, or 80, or 90, or 20, I can't remember, but a lot more dangerous than an abortion. Why aren't we talking about that? Why aren't we clarifying that? The responsibility that you take on when you make that decision, you can either worry that it's going to be made too big, or that it's going to be made too small, and they'll think it's a manicure. So you were on this tightrope of how to present it. Was it as horrible as the right wing and the scaremongers said it was, and all this experience that people had with kitchen table abortions would attest to the fact that it was horrible and it was a big thing? Or was it so easy that, during legalized abortion, people really went on their lunch hour? You don't want to make something like that too light, and you don't want to make it too big. So that was very hard for people to kind of calibrate when creating campaigns around the issue. All of that being said, it's water over the dam or under the bridge. It's my phone, I will ignore it. But I will say just a couple of things about coming up now. If I were you, and I am me, I do this. I would give to make sure that poor women or women who are 3 states away from an abortion-friendly state funded so that no woman has to bear a child that she doesn't want, isn't prepared for. To me, that's the A number one. The obvious second, B is work on the state level, because every single, what we ignored were state legislatures, We just ignored it. We just thought it was a federal issue and it was over. It's now it's going to be state by state by state, which is the way RPG wanted it in the first place. It's going to mean some states are not going to have it, but it's going to mean that we're going to have to fill the gaps, and that's what I think lies ahead.
I know there's some questions, so I know in the front row there's some questions.
I was wondering, you wrote this book when you were already 81, right?
I started at 78 and published it at 83.
Right, so by that time, you had your 2 daughters and your son were already actually older also. And I'm just wondering, did they know about this book prior to it coming out, or were they surprised to read it, or was there any discussion, or was it your grandchildren that you really, where you really felt like there was more of a discussion? I'm just wondering how the younger generations in your family reacted, responded.
The question, just for the Instagram folks, is about how the younger generations responded of Letty's family responded to her book.
Well, I've written about my children and my grandchildren through my whole writing life when they are relevant to an issue, because I think it's important to always ground things. I'm not an objective journalist, I'm an advocacy journalist. That means that when I'm going to argue for something, I need to ground myself in data, good research, solid research, accurate quotes, and the truth of my own experience. So I've always asked my children, from the time they could, understand what was going on at all, I would like to write about this thing that happened to you, or this conversation that we had. Is that okay with you? And I did that in this book. You're right, my parents' generation was all on. I went to all my living cousins, and I said, I'm going to write about your mom or dad, or you or your sibling. And instead of them like, oh, I don't know, they said, do you think that's all? Let me tell you this one. They gave me more. They wanted it out. They didn't want the burden either. They wanted it out there and let other people say, oh, that's not so bad. The last chapter in my book is You Think That's Bad. Because everywhere that I went while I was writing this book, and I was gathering anecdotes and memories and reading the letters, every time I told somebody about the book while I was writing it, they said something like, you think that's bad, and then gave me their secret. So I said to myself, this book is just going to do that in families, and it has done that. And people told me at their Seder table, they made shame and secrecy as the subject. Because they had the family together, and they wanted to see if they could, get stuff up from the primordial ooze. And so it has freed people to speak and share. I would not have written anything that somebody didn't want me to write. It's their story. They own the story. I borrow it for a purpose. And if I was borrowing it for a bad purpose, make fun of it, that would be, for me, a writer's crime. But I'm doing it for a purpose that they understood completely. Thank you.
I want to say something about storytelling. You asked Letty right at the beginning, how did it feel to use the first names?
Yeah.
I have adjacent experience. I've sat in RJ circles and also at lead storytelling circles, and we give very simple prompts. Tell a story about a time when you had a secret. And one of the guidelines we give people is we're not looking for a general feeling. Well, I feel really secretive when I'm kind of lonely, and what's the time when you felt relaxed? Well, I feel really relaxed when I'm in a bath, candles, a drink, classical music. We want them to say, I felt secretive once when and then we want them to tell the story, because the story is much more meaningful to all of us if it's specific and true, rather than if it's general and vague. So you immediately get closer. And then I want to say something about how we introduce stories to children, because I was blessed with parents who were super discreet, but also practical and literal. So my sister died. We buried her at home. My dad nailed the coffin. He made the coffin himself. You cannot miss, when you're little, the coffin is being nailed shut by my dad as he weeps. You cannot miss that. And then they never lied about anything, so if you ask them, they just told you. So one of our children is conceived by a sperm donor. 2 are conceived by IVF. They have 1 experience of IVF. And one of our children has a genetic condition. And once a doctor said to me, I said, will the child grow out of it? And the doctor said, no, the child will grow with it. Well, I was devastated, because I was the one with the doctor say, no, the child will grow out of it. So, and then 1 child was adopted. There are 3 adoptions in my family. So what we did with these stories was we found age-appropriate ways to tell the stories, so we never had to tell a lie. And they did work out. So 2 of ours will say, oh yeah, we were creating a little glass dish. one will say, my father is the man with the golden gun, because we gave the donor a number, which was 007, which was not the donor. It was the man with the golden gun. So, and the genetic condition, that he never remembered our sitting him down to tell him he had it. Because we taught, as it was age appropriate language. Because I don't ever want to be caught saying, I'm sorry, I didn't tell you that. And
That's
then
so
I
great.
just
I'm adding your story to my
we had
library.
I don't know, we had 9 eggs and the only IVF cycle I've ever had, we had 9 eggs. We had 6 embryos. They were all in the hospital over the weekend, and we were in the country, and I kept saying to my husband, all our little babies are in New York, and we're here. And then 3 died over the weekend. So we got back on Monday, and I said, oh, 3 died over the weekend. I think there were, I forget now, but there were 6 embryos, 3 died over the weekend, we put 3 in and got 2. So then they would go around sometimes at parties and say, well, there were 3 of us, but 1 died over the weekend. And these are the same kids who, when rabbis would say, it's God she, it's God he, and everyone was all in arms, they were like, God's not he. And our children would run around saying, well, obviously God isn't rabbis. So you can start honestly and just move into
The complexity.
yeah, and age appropriate.
I love your attitude in telling us stories, because in my time, nobody would admit that their children weren't biologically or whatever. That they just wouldn't admit it. And look how wonderful and light it is. And the children must love being different.
Okay, one back there, and you, and then one back. Yes?
Me?
Yes.
Letty, thank you so much for this book. I'm not done. I'm savoring every minute. I am in my late 60s. I'm the youngest of 3. My mother's almost 100. And I call her a pathological liar about everything. I always say, Mom, you'd be a great fiction writer, but not a reporter. And I made a film with her, and I just finished my memoir. And I started my genealogy in 81. So I have a wealth of information. My father was shooting in the 50s. I have his World War II book. I was recording interviews, so I had interviews with people that are long gone. And then their stuff I found. But anyway, one thing, and actually one of my films, so my mother, I have the curly hair and the bump on the nose. It was about getting the nose job. My hair was getting straightened since 3rd grade. And it was about fitting in. So you were talking about fitting in. And I think it's because they came, which I did not get the nose job, but when I grew up, and where I grew up in Long Island, I always joke that the junior high school yearbook and high school yearbook were before and after pictures of a nose job, and Dr. Diamond was doing them, and it was a signature. I'm sure everybody knows Diamond here, right? Anyway, so so, but it was such, and my mother's maiden name was Abramowitz. Her father was Abraham Abramowitz. And they tell a story that their cousin would go down to the south, and he would never do any business. He changed his name to Abbott. So it was always about fitting in. My film is about my journey to forgive her, because we did not have a good relationship. I left home very young. And anyway, long story short, I think it was that they came from, so I'm second generation American, my mother's first, but this anti-Semitism was so intense, so it was a double message. Don't look Jewish, fit in. I remember when I was on the Today Show for one of my films, and my mother's first comment is, you sound too Jewish, you need to go to elocution class. It's like, I am Jewish, what's wrong with that? But you better marry Jewish. So my life issue is trust. I never married. But, so first of all, thank you. Because also, you talked about the Galicians and the Litvaks, and I was just talking to my mother walking over. But her line is, I don't remember. I don't know, I don't remember. She said it so many times that I edited my film, her saying that in so many places. She blocks everything out. So I asked, I said, I've just read this book. I'm reading this book. And finally, they're explaining, because her father was a Litvak, and her mother was from Poland and Galicia. Right, and you were giving me this little information. So I just wanted to get that off my mind, and then I'm thinking about your supposed maybe twin, and wondered if you had researched like where the family's buried, because where would they have buried this? Oh,
they wouldn't.
Suppose they wouldn't, you don't think so?
They would not lower.
Well, my mother had a sister, and this is actually my film, and none of her family knew she had a sister. The sister died in 1.5 years from pneumonia. But when I brought my mother together with her 3 surviving cousins, they had no idea. And then one of her cousins says, if anyone had cancer, you never said it, right?
No, of course
Never.
not.
So yeah, it was that always hiding and putting on that.
Yeah, you're putting on a fun.
Do you know Danny Shapiro?
I do.
Yeah.
I'm on her podcast
Yeah,
on June 22nd.
Yeah, of course, right.
Do you want to speak to the reason that anti-Semitism is connected to this festival? And where do you think anti-Semitism plays into this, just to produce that piece?
Well, on the subject of anti-Semitism, I can say 2 things. One is I never experienced anti-Semitism until the women's movement, which was weird, very unexpected.
How did you experience it?
I did a piece after Mexico City. I don't know, did you follow the United Nations Decade on Women? There were conferences first in Mexico City, then Nairobi, Copenhagen, and then. And then the upshot of the first one in Mexico City, rather than be a commitment around the world, international proclamation to solve female hunger, because in cultures all over the world, girls are served last. If there's food, the girls get it last. So hunger is a real issue. Or girls are undereducated. No, didn't come out of Mexico City conference where all the countries of the world are gathered to talk about women's issues. No, it wasn't about education. It was Zionism's racism. That's what came out of the Mexico City Women's Conference. And it just blew me away. It was like, am I identifying as a pro-woman feminist in order to liberate people to hate Jews or to want there not to be in Israel? We can debate Zionism because my opinion has all evolved over time, but certainly at the time when this took place in 1975, I was horrified. And then it happened again, and even worse in Copenhagen in 1980. They did the conferences every 5 years. And it ended up in Beijing in 1995. It so threw me that I took about 8 months of my life and interviewed Jewish women in the women's movement all over the country and wrote a piece for this called Anti-Semitism in the Women's Movement, where I had experienced it in weird ways, like where we would be planning a conference and I would look at my calendar and say, oh, we can't have it on that day, it's Rosh Hashanah. And it was like, oh, well, how many people observe that? I said, how many people observe that? It's our high holy days. Oh, yeah, but, we mean, Jews are what? How many percent of the population? They're going to be, this is a national conference. I said, we can't come if you make it on Rosh Hashanah. Do you want all the Jews to not come? Because most Jews won't come. Maybe that wasn't true, but I'd like to believe it was true. But I found, to me, that's anti-Semitism because it was so unexpected,
We will find it for you. We'll send it to you. I mean, there's just a few more questions. Just really quick, we say your question. Oh, Jess also. Okay, you say quick. We're going to do lightning rounds. Quick.
I certainly know. I thought that the description of the life that you live was very moving and touching, I think. But I think there would be very little to the new 3 new Supreme Court judges that were nominated, and that all that you said would make no difference to them whatsoever, and you would have lost that, no matter what happened to your wife. I don't know, I think it's been coming for 50 years, and the Republicans have finally managed to do it. And that's the one thing that so it's very troubling and very sad.
Thank you. Okay, I think we
associated with assimilation, but somebody else has, you've already touched on that. The other question I had, which came out of what you're talking about, with how we could have handled abortion differently. And I wonder about, in my mind, I'm drawing a parallel between the abortion situation and anti-Semitism in the country now. And I worry that as Jews, we are following the same path that women did in terms of abortion, in terms of addressing anti-Semitism. We are so concerned, I mean, many of us have grown up with assimilation being the sort of what we're aspiring to, and we don't stick our heads up, and we don't make a stink, which is what women have done for all these years in terms of abortion, and then it ended up being taken away from us. And how can we learn a lesson from the abortion debacle and approach this fight for against anti-Semitism in a more positive way?
Really quickly, just you can answer the question maybe.
Well, did you want the lightning thing back?
Nancy, do you want to add to that?
Oh, no, mine was a totally different question, so.
You want to share your comments?
Can I share? Quick? Yeah, okay. Well, first, quick share is that my grandmother was SEAL, and so when you said that, I kind of got goosebumps, and she had postpartum depression, and when my dad was born, and so he lived with his aunt for the first, 6 or 9 months of his life and never knew it. It was a secret until he overheard it, on the phone, listening in when he was a teenager or something. So a lot of secrets. But my question was more about, you mentioned about housewives and how that kind of, there was an esteem to housewives in your parents' generation. And I'm wondering just a little bit of the generational trajectory of how that went from something that was maybe kind of cool to the feminine mystique and the not so cool, and what your thoughts are about that.
So the two questions, if you're still online, but are you? Are number one is, what is the relationship between anti-Semitism today and how we're dealing with it as relates to how Letty described the women's movement not speaking up enough? And this goes to our topic: why are we not speaking up enough? What are we so ashamed of? Number one. Number two, Nancy, just to give us a little bit more history of the housewife from the 50s to the feminine mystique to today.
I'll go backwards because that's a harder one. The glorification of the housewife was a reaction to the fact that Rosie the Riveter had to be persuaded to work in factories when women's labor was needed. So we had to get rid of the whole home-based, iconography, and instead we have Rosie with that poster with the strong arm, and you can see she's in a factory and she's contributing to the war effort. So when you want to get women out, you make that glamorous, and when you want to get women back into the home because you need the returning servicemen to have their jobs back, you glorify the housewife and you show women on television having orgasms over wax floors, which basically really was what we all were exposed to. The competition to have shinier floors and, children with shinier teeth and better diapers, and endless. We had to compete to be better at everything home-based. And in the Jewish world, I think, again, the complication was that even if a woman really had a talent and a yearning and a passion and wanted to be out of the house as well as maybe, be at home and out or some combination of it, it was considered really a shanda for a woman to be working and not overseeing the home, not being the ball buster. It was just, it wasn't the Jewish ideal. And the idyllic image of the happy home, that the shalom bayit, the woman who's in charge of peace in the home and beauty in the home and making Shabbat and doing, in my house we had 42 sets of dishes. You know, my mother was always schlepping different dishes for, company milk and company Pasadena milk and company, and Seder plates, and Seder. Honestly, the perfectionism of her housewifery was staggering to the point where I think it made me a feminist. It's like, I am not going to do it in gadget slavery in the service of kashrut or anything else. And my father just, came to the table. Reclined. In my house, the man said the Kiddush and the women stood beside them silently, literally. Like a king and queen on a chessboard. Yeah, and that was the model, though, that you had to subsume yourself into your husband. She was Mrs. Jack Cotton. She was not Seal Cotton.
Well, can I complicate, but I want to complicate that question. Okay. Our community is going to be watching Boycott on Sunday, where we're going to talk about, that's actually an American story, but about Israel. And we have been talking about Israel and Palestine and the ways in which we are not showing up, and we have not shown up at all enough or spoken up at all enough about what is happening currently in Israel. And so just to make your question, Linda, I'm just bandwagoning here. Okay, thank you. But to make your question more complex, how can we I want to speak up the way Linda says around anti-Semitism that I experience here in New York and in the U.S. and that we see, and I want to speak up about Israel, and I want to not have those two things be conflated. Help us.
Exactly. We are doing such a disservice to our community by insisting on the definition of anti-Semitism that includes any criticism of Israel. And because then it's really hard to make anti-Semitism feel like a gut level thing, like a hatred thing. When Potter Stewart said, I know when I see it about pornography, we know anti-Semitism when we feel it. And you have to twist yourself into a pretzel to say that when somebody is criticizing the current Israeli government, that's anti-Semitic. Because it means they don't really want there to be an Israel. It isn't what it means. None of that is what it means. Jewish Voice for Peace doesn't necessarily believe there shouldn't be an Israel, although there are non-Zionists in that organization. There are also Jewish scholars in that organization, who've gone to camp and gone to Cheder and gone and taught themselves or been taught in an enviable way their Judaism. They are full, rich, practicing Jews, and they are critical of a non-Jewish government, of a government that acts un-Jewishly, put it that way. And we've conflated in a way that has diluted the real power of what anti-Semitism is and feels like and does to us. And we're losing friends over it. We're losing allies over it. We're becoming seen as, and then when we have something to say about anti-Semitism, it looks like, we're exercising Jewish power, which plays into the anti-Semitism, because then we're afraid to be so public about it, because it'll look like we're controlling the media, or we're objecting to the New York Times. Whenever they object to the New York Times and they put their banners on a building right outside of the New York Times building, accusing the Times of being anti-Israel, it's such nonsense. When you have responsible reporters over there reporting what's happening, and then it's called anti-Semitic, because it criticizes and it outs the behavior of a government that reacts disproportionately in situations that, leave people dead and leave people in Gaza where there is no escape. Oh, well, we dropped leaflets because the IDF is a very humane army and it warns people when it's about to bomb them. Right, we do, but Gaza, you can't get out of Gaza. It's an open-air prison, as they say. So you have to be able to say what is and not be accused of being a self-hating Jew, which, we have to stand up and say, I am a Jew, and that's why my values tell me that what's happening is unconscionable, and that the fact we treat others the way we were treated is a Shanda.
There is so many. I do want to, if you need wine, I want you to get into your wine. We're near so much more. I don't know how much time you have. What I want to do is maybe close our session and then we can ask questions at the end. Is that okay with everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to invite Misha. I'm going to jumping out of his chair. Misha is going to help us close tonight with Sfirata Omer. But before we do, I just want to give you the opportunity for kind of any final words for our community and maybe a blessing for this space. You got one for us.
A blessing for the Zohar. I don't truck in blessings. I don't feel holy enough, quite frankly. And the only thing I'm holy about is that I was once called a holy troublemaker. I'll accept that one. But I do want to say that I felt tremendous support for my truth telling in this room. And your nods were like balm to the soul, to the neshama. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Letty, for this beautiful, beautiful, powerful, moving evening. We're going to do Sfirata Omer, which is the counting of the 50 days between Passover and Shavuot. I can't be the man who comes into the women's space and leads it, so I'm going to need everybody to just speak the words with me, okay? But I will say this, it's a strange counting that we do, and this evening it strikes me that these 50 days in which we count could each count for a story that we need to share. So we have 10 more days left, today's 40. Let's all try and count every day with a sharing of a story that we need to share with our kids, with our friends, with our family, with whoever needs to be shared. So, Hineni Mukhan Umezuman, I'm ready and prepared Lekayem Mitzvah Seshes Sfirat HaOmer, to perform the mitzvah of the counting of the Omer. We can say the bracha together. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kiddushanu B'mitzvotav V'tzivanu. You can repeat after me. Al Sfirat HaOmer. We bless you for commanding us to count the Omer. And we say, Hayom, Chamisha Shavuot, וחמישה ימים לעומר, שהם 40 יום. Today are 5 weeks and 5 days, which are 40 days to the Omer. Amen.
Let's just do one more round of applause. I just want to say, like, a massive thank you for this intergenerational space, for this women's space, for this many people space, for your true stories, for your big heart, for your courage. Oh, okay.
You know, I believe in synchronicity, which is like things happening when they should happen, or you figure out later that they should happen, and then you realize they did. Yesterday I was cleaning out closets that I don't normally look at all. And, yeah, if you turn to unlock it. Do you have that picture? I think so too. If anybody has the book, I would like to hold it up or some pass it around. I tell the story about how I had a big argument with my mother about my bat mitzvah dress. We went shopping at Ormax, and I fell in love with this dress. And my mother, who, as I told you, was the queen of superstition, said you cannot wear black at your bat mitzvah. You're a little girl, girls don't wear black. Black is Shiva. And as you can see, I won.
was a Taylor Michael Camsoil in honor of your grandmother, the runaway bride. A blessing on your head, muzzle tov, and see your daughter wed, muzzle tov, such a love.
Somebody said to me, you said to me that I say everything.
Yes,
Right?
you said that.
You said that, Michael.
I remember that.
And I do say that.
You're gonna give it to your daughters?
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank
Sunday,
you.
Sunday at 4 o'clock is boycott, and then the closing is on Shavuot night on the 25th at the Clemente Center. I hope you guys can join us. Toda rabah.